she shouldn't be allowed to run. They're also conducting a second criminal investigation into Hillary's illegal pay-for-play corruption at the State Department.
Donald Trump found guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree.
Before Donald Trump himself was convicted of 34 felonies today, the list of his close allies who were convicted of or had pled guilty to crimes was unusually long for anyone in public life, let alone anybody who's an elected official. Can't pretend not to be a criminal while you're a criminal defendant. Why not just run with it? I mean, so this is now who he is surrounding himself with, and part of his message is pick me. I'm on the criminal side of the ledger.
Oh, that's gonna hurt!
While Fox News hosts were clutching their $60 Trump Bibles in despair.
We have gone over a cliff in America.
My mom is celebrating. She texted me that she was dancing after the verdict, dancing. And then she kept all day sending me 34, 34, 34.
On other networks like MSNBC, host Rachel Maddow was explaining what this means for the rule of law in America and ultimately how it's a wrench in Trump's plan to dismantle our institutions.
If the Republican Party is allowed to and succeeds at waging war on the legal system because of this case, because of this defendant, because of his criminal liability, do you think that they uphold the legitimacy of the legal system for all other cases and all other defendants? No. If they tear it down and they are allowed to physically intimidate the people in the system and get the American people to not accept the legitimacy of this court's finding because it's their guy who's been targeted by it, that's the end. That's it. It doesn't come back for other people if it goes away for Trump.
The problem was there weren't enough Rachel Maddows out there, and a lot of analysts not on Fox acted as if the prosecution's case wasn't that strong. The fact is I've been analyzing live trials for years, and I was shocked how strong the case was. I mean, you don't really get to see the evidence until it starts. I was wondering not just whether or not he was going to become guilty, but why the DOJ never ended up bringing these charges. But if you were listening to a lot of the cable news, you wouldn't have gotten that impression. And that was a major disservice to the American public, because I don't think they were as prepared for this verdict as they should have been.
His advisor and campaign aide, Roger Stone, was charged, convicted, and sentenced to prison. His White House National Security Advisor, Mike Flynn, was charged and convicted. His campaign advisor, George Papadopoulos, was charged, convicted, sentenced to prison. His business's CFO, Alan Weisselberg, was charged, convicted, and sentenced to prison. His business itself was found guilty of criminal tax fraud. And real estate organizations can't go to prison, otherwise it might have. Donald Trump himself has now joined that ignominious list. It now sort of feels inevitable looking back at it, but until it happened tonight, nobody could be sure it ever would. That said, he seems to know it was coming, right? He seems to have known something. There's this remarkable headline in the New York Times just this week. Quote, Trump leans into an outlaw image as his criminal trial concludes. The former president has increasingly aligned himself with fellow defendants and people convicted of crimes. As we headed toward this unanimous all counts guilty verdict tonight, Donald Trump has recently, in fact, been bringing convicted and accused felons with him to campaign events, including people accused of murder. He's even been bringing ex-cons and convicted felons with him to stand behind him in court. And part of his message is pick me. I'm on the criminal side of the ledger. Pick me and my criminal friends. We'll take care of this legal system that you've got here. Convicted of 34 felonies tonight.
Let's take, for example, that day that Michael Cohen was being cross-examined by Trump's team, and they brought out the fact that during one of the phone calls, he also most likely talked about a 14-year-old that harassed him. So Michael Cohen's response was, yeah, maybe I did bring that up, but I also talked to him about the Stormy Daniels payment, which wasn't that unusual of the fact. It was a 90-second phone call. We know that on tape, Donald Trump talked to Michael Cohen about the Karen McDougal payment, and that only lasted 47 seconds. So it wasn't that huge of a point in cross-examination. But if you were listening to most of that cable news analysis, you would have thought that was the kind of gotcha moment that was the entire case.
I would be remiss, Cohen, if I didn't ask you about this moment in the 21 hours of testimony where Todd Blanche yelled at you and he was like, you lie. And there was a phone call in October that could have been about multiple topics. And then the media ran with that and was like, oh my God, there was a Perry Mason moment. Meanwhile, there was an objection. The objection was sustained. And everybody who I knew in the courtroom was saying that that was not a significant moment at all. It didn't even make a dent. But when you turned on CNN or MSNBC, whether it was Ellie Honig or Ari Melber on they were pushing this narrative.
Let me just jump to those idiots for a quick second before you finish your question. There's something very wrong with Ellie Honig, to be honest with you. There's something really fundamentally fucked up with this guy. I used to actually say, oh yeah, he's a friend of mine, to the extent that, we would speak to each other. He's on my podcast 7-8 times. He's trying to be just like Ari Melber. They're trying to be contrarians. They're trying to show, we don't really sort of play this one side. Well, there's only one side to truth. There's only one side to being right. All right. It's not like Donald when he said, when he was talking about the Nazis in Charlottesville marching, well, there's good people on both sides. No, there's not. All right. It's the same thing. Melber's an idiot. So is Ellie Honig. By the way, how do you know that Ellie Honig is an idiot? How do you know that he's wrong? Because Donald Trump was held accountable and guilty on 34 counts, despite all of Honig said, I wouldn't be shocked if it's an acquittal. He goes, I never liked this case at all. They never should have brought it. It's a weak case. You really aren't going to be able to put the misdemeanor into the federal crime. I've never heard of anything like that. That's because he was a shit lawyer all along.
I was listening to that, trying to see what was going on also. And so what did I do? I did my diligence. I went back and I went to the opening statement. I thought, did I miss something? Did the prosecution say that somehow this phone call was the linchpin of their case? That this was the only time he ever talked to Donald Trump? That this was the only time David Pecker had he never talked to Donald Trump? So I went back to that opening statement, and sure enough, the prosecution didn't even mention that phone call. They mentioned lots of conversations between David Pecker and Donald Trump and other conversations between Michael Cohen and Donald Trump, but they didn't mention that phone call. So this is what the jury cares about. They care about what the prosecution told them to expect in evidence. And then if you don't follow up that in evidence, you lose credibility, and that's how you lose the case. So yes, if the prosecution had said in that opening, this phone call, he said this, and then, and cross, well, did he maybe also said that? That could have been a bigger deal. Maybe still not everything, but definitely maybe more in line with the analysis that you were hearing. But the fact is, they didn't even mention the call. So Ben and I in the political beatdown, rehashed that. And so the MeidasTouch community got to hear the more factual analysis of why that cross-examination wasn't that big of a deal. But if you were watching the cable news, you would have thought perhaps the defense was winning the case. That is a disservice. And that kind of journalism of how this case was even covered was disappointing. For some reason, there was this desire to act as if Donald Trump had a better defense than he did. The fact is, his defense case was awful. For as much as the prosecution won the case, the defense lost the case. His defense witness, Robert Costello, was horrible. And even on closing, the defense attorney made some strange statements about how the Access Hollywood tape was actually just another day in the campaign. Why would you say that to a jury when we all lived through that Access Hollywood tape? We know that wasn't another day at the campaign.
In this video, I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet, just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything. Grab them by the you can do anything. That's what you said, correct?
Well, historically, that's true with stars.
It's true with stars that they can grab women by the
Well, that's what it's. If you look over the last million years, I guess that's been largely true. Not always, but largely true. Unfortunately or fortunately.
And you consider yourself to be a star?
I think you can say that, yeah.
You know, they made these kind of unnecessary statements that really made them lose credibility to the jury. But you didn't really hear all of that. How many times did you hear the fact that the jury got to hear Donald Trump on a tape talk about giving a payment to Karen McDougal in a very similar way as Stormy Daniels? And not only that, but asked to do it in cash. His whole crime was that he was trying to hide this other criminal activity by falsifying business records. Somebody who wants to pay a $150,000 payment in cash seems like somebody who's trying to hide something. If you can sit there and be a juror and there's silence in that courtroom, and what you hear ring out is the sound of the defendant talking about paying very similar payment as in cash, try to tell me that that may not have been the most crucial piece of testimony in the trial. Did you hear that at all in the analysis? I mean, I don't know if I did, or if I did, I barely did. For whatever reason, a lot of the analysis wasn't willing to actually report how the trial was unfolding. It wasn't that surprising. In all the trials I've covered, seeing that kind of evidence that they had was momentous. I heard another analyst say that, you know, this was just a circumstantial case, like as if that didn't make it strong. I'm here to tell you that pretty much every trial is a circumstantial case. In order for it to be direct evidence, it would have to almost be like a confession, like you got the person on tape seeing it. You actually recorded the person doing it on tape, or the person confessed. That kind of direct evidence, if you truly have that kind of direct evidence, that person is pleading out. It's not going to trial. Pretty much every trial I have ever seen is all circumstantial. You were listening to that analysis, you would have thought for some reason all the documents that put forward, all the tweets they were putting forward, all the really excellent witnesses the prosecution put forward was somehow not as important because it was circumstantial. We try people all the time because of circumstantial evidence. It's how credible those witnesses are, how consistent their stories are, how backed up are they by the documents. And they were in this case. And that's why this case was so strong. And that's why they were willing to convict Donald Trump. Not because of any kind of political thing, but because they had the evidence. I think the one disservice that was really made in this trial was that they didn't allow cameras in this courtroom or even audio in the courtroom. Yes, New York law typically doesn't allow it. Could they have made an exception? Absolutely. And I think that's where there should have been a leeway. Not by allowing him to violate his gag order so many times without holding him in contempt, but by allowing everybody to see it. Could he have made it a circus? Sure. Did he make it a circus anyway? Yes. And he lied so many times about the impartiality of the judge. But if you were able to actually see it, he could have never made that argument. Because I read a lot of the transcripts and he was very even-handed. And everybody can read those transcripts. It is all online, but it is difficult to read the transcript. It would have been much easier if people could have just been listening to it as they went around their business, like a lot of other live stream trials. And that would have been the way to help protect our justice system from the kind of constant lies and disparagement of it. And so I hope note that Jack Smith and any other prosecutor that goes forward with this takes that into consideration and not only supports cameras in the next trial, but asks for it. That way, we aren't all dependent on what some legal analyst says on some cable network. Yes, MeidasTouch did a phenomenal job of supporting and reporting actual facts, showing you the checks and the invoices and giving you the substance behind why they were giving the opinions. Wouldn't it be great also if we all got a chance to hear it and decide for ourselves whether or not that witness is credible or not? Our public court systems are meant to be public. Let's make them truly public and accessible. If Donald Trump, goes on and has his next trial as he's supposed to.
Real quick, Meta just changed their algorithm to suppress political content. Please follow our Instagram at MeidasTouch right now as we head towards 400,000 followers so you don't miss a beat.